Hello and welcome to the Political History of the United States. Episode 4.65, Cornwallis Cornered. By the end of August, Henry Clinton realized that Washington had given up on his plans of attacking New York, and that he, in conjunction with the French, were moving south towards Cornwallis. Clinton wrote to Cornwallis warning him of Washington's approach, and letting him know that he expected a significant French armament would be accompanying him. Lord Cornwallis had relocated himself to a tiny peninsula, not far from where our story began, just some 30 or so miles away from Jamestown. I think it goes without saying that the Battle of Yorktown is going to be a very big deal. It will indeed be the event that wraps up our series on the American Revolution. Before we can get to the fighting, though, we need to understand exactly how it came to be. This week we are going to head back to Virginia and examine just how Lord Cornwallis would end up in Yorktown. The late spring and early summer of 1781 was a confusing time for both the Americans and the British. In New York, Clinton was busy trying to predict where the Americans would make their move. Would they focus on the Southern Theater? Would Washington attempt another strike on New York? The Americans, likewise, were making the same tactical calculations regarding an attack on New York versus, much to the chagrin of George Washington, moving the war south. Meanwhile, down in the South, Cornwallis was struggling to figure out just what his role was. If you will recall from last time, Clinton had sent Cornwallis earlier orders, letting him know that he was going to have to peel off a large portion of his army to send north to Clinton, while at the same time finding a place to build a naval station to help protect the English Navy. Cornwallis was annoyed at the order, letting him know that he was not to conduct any major operations, and was outright indignant at the demand to send off half of his army. Despite this frustration, however, he had his orders and set out to find a place to set up shop. Some months earlier, Washington had sent Lafayette down towards the south, giving him orders to help shore up Virginia and to harass Cornwallis. Somewhat ironically, it was during this early phase that Cornwallis had decided against using Yorktown and instead decided to march towards Portsmouth. As he left Williamsburg in early June, Lafayette would follow, ordering Anthony Wayne to attack the British rear. This nearly proved to be a disaster, though, as Wayne ended up marching right into an ambush near Green Springs. Lafayette was able to provide enough reinforcements to allow Wayne an avenue of escape. However, it had cost the Americans over 150 troops that they could hardly afford to lose. Lafayette would later explain to Washington that his decision to pursue Cornwallis, and ultimately make the ill-fated call for an attack, was largely because he had become aware of the peace overtures coming out of Russia. During our last episode, we had talked about Catherine the Great of Russia and Joseph II of Austria, who were now offering to help work out a settlement in the conflict. Lafayette was likewise aware that both the French and the Spanish were showing a distressing willingness to consider the peace under the concept of iudi possidetis, the idea that you retain what you're actively holding. Lafayette understood that a peace under this concept would see the United States having to sacrifice large swaths of the South. Following the losses at Green Springs, Lafayette would mostly just tail Cornwallis without doing much to bring about an engagement. During this time, Lafayette dealt with the difficulty that so many before him already had. He was in desperate need of men that Virginia resisted handing over, primarily in the form of resistance to the draft. This situation would become so serious in Hampshire County, Virginia, that Daniel Morgan had to march some 400 militia into the region to put down the resistance. Although the most violent resistance was swiftly dealt with by Morgan, it did little to fix the actual problem, and resistance to the draft would continue. When we step back and look at the American Revolution, the summer of 1781 stands out as something of a confused time for both sides. As we had discussed last time, Washington was still floating around New York wanting to launch that large-scale offensive. However, that fizzled out, and the only movement at all was a very light probing maneuver that the British were easily able to shoo away in early July. Based on his writings, Clinton at least seemed nominally concerned that a joint Franco-American army could be upon him at any time, hence that initial decision to strip away a chunk from Cornwallis's army. Even here, though, we find Clinton working with seemingly poor intelligence, where he had both underestimated the size of Lafayette's army in Virginia, while at the same time overestimating the size of Cornwallis's army. By the end of July, however, Clinton had more or less reversed course on his request for troops. He still did request that Cornwallis send any available troops to New York. However, one would think that he probably would have anticipated Cornwallis's response to such a request. Probably predictably, Cornwallis looked around, determined that there was nobody to spare, and that was that. This is why, by the time that Washington was heading away from New York, Clinton had already gone ahead and canceled the troop transfer. By early August, Cornwallis had moved again, this time to a position between the York and James River, at a place called Yorktown. Now, if you look at a map, Yorktown is in an absolutely terrible strategic position. We have talked before about the danger of fighting with a river to your back. Well, Yorktown is located on a peninsula, which means you have a river to your back in 3 of the 4 directions. Should an opposing army do something crazy, like cutting off your access to the Williamsburg Neck while bombarding you from the rivers, well, you would find yourself to be in a pretty unfortunate spot. It goes without saying that we are going to spend a whole lot of time in Yorktown. The rest of our episode today and the entire next episode are going to be dedicated to this single engagement, because it really was that significant. So to start this discussion, I want to explore 2 questions. The first question is, why on earth would Cornwallis put himself into such a vulnerable position to begin with? Second, why did he just linger there for so long instead of trying to get to a safer spot? We know that upon getting his initial orders from Clinton in June to establish a safe harbor for the British Navy, that he had already ruled out using Yorktown. This is despite the fact that in those orders from Clinton back in June, Cornwallis was instructed to send half of his army to New York and then set out to secure the town of York. Writing back to Clinton, Cornwallis let him know that he would instead march to the more defensible port of Portsmouth, located in modern-day Norfolk. This position made a certain degree of sense, especially as compared to where Cornwallis would eventually end up at Yorktown. Located on the Virginia mainland and not on a peninsula, Portsmouth would have still given Cornwallis nearby access to the mouth of the Chesapeake, without dangerously leaving him hemmed in. Historian Woody Holton writes that Cornwallis seemed to be concerned from the get-go of the vulnerability of following orders and moving his troops to Yorktown, and was in that moment more concerned with not being blamed for losing Virginia by taking up on an exposed position than he was of anything going on up in New York. This deepens the mystery of how exactly Cornwallis ended up camped out in Yorktown when he himself was worried about that same position. It was on this march to Portsmouth where we see Anthony Wayne, at Lafayette's direction, attempt that attack of the British rear near Green Springs that nearly turned out to be so disastrous for the Americans. Now, Clinton was not at all amused by the decision of Cornwallis to ignore the order to establish a base in Yorktown and to instead move to Portsmouth. Cornwallis had arrived in Portsmouth on July 20th, only to have a very angry Henry Clinton remind him that Yorktown was the objective, not Portsmouth. By the end of July, Cornwallis was once again on the move, this time heading to Yorktown, per Clinton's orders, to establish fortifications. Now, note that this was the same communication between Clinton and Cornwallis where Clinton had backed off his orders for Cornwallis to send half of his army to the north, to New York. With Cornwallis now moving back towards Yorktown at Clinton's insistence, we have to ask why Clinton was so determined to seize that particular spot. one that Cornwallis himself had such serious reservations about. Cornwallis, seemingly aware of how this might turn out, began collecting evidence to exonerate himself from what he was worried was about to be a looming disaster. Historian Richard Middlecoff examines the finger-pointing campaign that would follow in the aftermath of Yorktown, which provides critical insights into exactly why Clinton was so steadfast on Cornwallis taking up a position at Yorktown. Clinton would, after some time, come to blame the initial decision of Cornwallis to march into Virginia, which triggered the ultimate events at Yorktown some months later. Middlecoff writes that the decision to march into Virginia was always something that should have been run past Clinton, something that, as we have discussed, Cornwallis certainly did not do. Cornwallis defended this accusation by stating that remaining in the Carolinas would risk the entire Southern Army. Despite the accusations of Clinton, however, be aware that many of these were coming after the British defeat. There was a fair amount of finger-pointing here, and it should be noted that Clinton could have just as easily ordered Cornwallis to turn around and go back into Carolina. Yet, that order never came. When Cornwallis had set out for Virginia, he had a much different idea for what the war would look like. He had written to Clinton that the purpose of moving on Virginia was not to take up a defensive posture, but rather was to conquer the state and restore British control. Recall that the idea of abandoning the Carolinas was not, in Cornwallis's estimation, an admission of defeat in the region, but rather was a rethinking of the Southern strategy. A victory in Virginia would cut supply lines to the Carolinas and Georgia, and would, ideally, starve out the resistance that had so plagued the British for the last 6 months. Clinton's orders to take up a position at Yorktown and strip away half of Cornwallis's army was diametrically opposed to Cornwallis's objective. Per Middlecoff, the decision of Clinton was multifaceted. First and foremost, although the position taken up by Cornwallis at Portsmouth was near the mouth of the Chesapeake, the area around Yorktown and Gloucester were undeniably better and located closer. We likewise have ample evidence of this area being a good natural port. Yorktown is near where the original Jamestown settlers had landed. It was a very good natural port. Clinton worried that if Lafayette could take up a position in Yorktown, he could easily turn it into a base for French naval operations. This was not without precedent either. The French had previously used that same site back during 1779, and were well aware of the naval advantages that it had. Clinton likewise had expanded his hopes for a port at Yorktown to include the ability to dock, not just transports and frigates, but battleships as well. The deep waters near Yorktown were ideal for docking those large British man-of-war ships. The plan to establish such a British harbor at Yorktown appeared to have expanded to the point where the British fleet would relocate from the often difficult-to-access harbor in New York to this new Virginian stronghold. The problem is that Clinton failed to recognize that although Yorktown did make for an ideal port, it was anything but ideal for those land-based defenders. The land around Yorktown was all low-lying, meaning that there were no elevated positions for the defenders. Cornwallis likewise recognized that everything was predicated upon British naval superiority. Should the French manage to gain control over the York and the James River, the British were at dire risk of entrapment. Despite these very serious risks, Clinton by this point had become fixated on the prospect of a strong British harbor on that location, and seems to have become blinded to the considerable risk associated with holding that position. These vulnerabilities were obvious enough to Cornwallis that even before the siege began, he was already preparing to defend himself from what he knew was coming. So clearly, Cornwallis himself understood what a terrible position he was in. This again being illustrated by the fact that he was preemptively writing his report to exonerate himself in the event that things should take a catastrophic turn. Unfortunately for the British, the Americans also appeared to very quickly grasp the serious tactical blunder that Cornwallis had been ordered into. Lafayette wrote to Washington on August the 6th letting him know that Cornwallis had taken up a position in the York and on the opposite side of the riverbank in Gloucester. He informed Washington that York is surrounded by rivers and a morass, and that the only connection to the mainland is via a narrow neck. He concludes the letter by acknowledging that New York is the target, obviously. But, just saying, should a fleet head down this way, good things would likely result. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. A few days later, on August the 11th, Lafayette was even more direct to Washington that Cornwallis was entrenching at York and Gloucester, and that the sooner they hit him, the better. He informed Washington that the British were sick and made clear that this was about as vulnerable as one could hope them to be. Washington would first note the arrival of Cornwallis in Yorktown in his diary on August the 16th. However, he says very little about his feelings on the subject. This entry was in response to the letter from Lafayette, but it merely notes that Cornwallis is in York and Gloucester and is throwing up works. He is entirely silent as to the hints from Lafayette that he might want to do something about it. It is indeed not until August 27th that we see Washington for the first time taking the situation in Yorktown more seriously, writing to Lafayette to get more information about the state of things and questioning where he should land his men, who were to be transported by ship to Virginia in order to most effectively trap the British. Washington wraps up the letter by asking Lafayette how many entrenching tools he has at his disposal, which is a pretty good clue for where his mind was now at. So, a quick recap. Here is what we know. Cornwallis had moved, reluctantly, into a position at both Yorktown and across the river in Gloucester. By the end of August, George Washington was becoming aware of what a corner Cornwallis had placed himself in, and was suddenly interested in taking advantage of a potential British mistake. Despite his reservations about establishing himself at Yorktown and Gloucester, Cornwallis had his orders. At the end of July, Cornwallis sailed to the York River, taking up his position in Yorktown as well as a much smaller holding on the north bank of the York in Gloucester. The plan called for the construction of 2 fortifications to hold the point, a task that Cornwallis would quickly start on. To this task, Cornwallis would order that many of the African Americans who had defected to the British to escape bondage to build the forts, as he judged it was too hot for his troops to do it. This came at a moment when disease was ravaging many of those same African Americans that were along with his army. Historian Woody Holton writes that when Cornwallis had abandoned Portsmouth, he had left behind droves of sick African Americans in an effort not to infect his army with the smallpox that was running rampant throughout the state. This stands as a stark reminder of the decision that so many Americans had to make. For the enslaved population, defection to the British in exchange for eventual emancipation may have seemed to be a tempting deal. However, there were always risks. From illness and the inherent dangers that come from war, to the individuals who were abandoned to their fates at Portsmouth, which likely meant a return to bondage. Defection to the British was anything but a sure bet for the future prosperity of many. Clinton had actually given Cornwallis a small amount of decision-making power at the end of July, giving him the option of either Yorktown or a location known as Old Point Comfort. Now, for our story, I'm not sure that it really makes a huge difference as to which one Cornwallis chose. Both locations were on that same peninsula, and both would have come with the same dangers of getting trapped. Cornwallis, although he did inspect Old Point Comfort, decided that he would take his chances with Yorktown. With his mind now made up, on August the 2nd, he would begin landing his men in the town. Yorktown then, as it remains today, was not some big metropolis. Rather, it was little more than just a sleepy village, which suddenly found itself about to be put on the map as it became the epicenter of the war. The town only had some 70 or so houses and was located on a bluff that ran along the river. York was a logical spot to some degree because it was located on a particularly narrow part of the adjoining river, and it was less than a mile from Gloucester on the opposite bank. At least initially, Cornwallis began the process of building forts at a rather slow pace. Now, although he was aware that Lafayette was making maneuvers to trap him, he was still not in that much danger. Even if he did get trapped, the French would still have to establish naval supremacy in the Chesapeake. And even if that happened, Lafayette did not possess that daunting of a force. If he really needed to, Cornwallis felt confident about his ability to just burst through the otherwise thin lines that Lafayette was forming. At the end of August, Cornwallis told Clinton that he felt that he would be able to have the fortifications finished sometime in early to mid-October. As the Americans recognized the position that Cornwallis was in, very quickly their focus turned towards making sure that they could take advantage of it. Originally, the plan had been for the Americans to take transports down to Virginia to avoid the long overland march. This, however, quickly proved to be a problem as there simply were not enough ships. As a result, only some 3,000 men were able to take the transports. These transports began arriving, along with the beginnings of that French fleet in the Chesapeake on August 30th. This was a big moment for the Franco-American alliance. It was no sure thing that de Grasse was going to reach the Chesapeake in time to take advantage of the situation. Should the British get there first, or if the French fleet got held up, it would be nothing more than another wasted opportunity. For those who went by ship, the journey was anything but a pleasure cruise. The lack of transports meant that those that were available were badly overloaded. The majority of the provisions had to be removed, meaning that the men had very little to eat. Weather likewise played an important factor, making the entire journey a thoroughly miserable affair. The men left to march overland would ultimately manage to catch a ride near Annapolis, courtesy of de Grasse. As the troops made their way to Virginia, the task of holding Cornwallis in place fell to Lafayette. Now, this was something of a delicate operation for the young Frenchman. On the one hand, he needed to take action to ensure that Cornwallis did not just pack up and leave, something which was a very real risk, and further, was not something that Lafayette really had any meaningful way to stop. This meant for Lafayette that the task was to ensure that Cornwallis hung out long enough that the Franco-American army could trap him, without doing so much that it would spook him and cause him to pull back entirely. During those late August and early September days, therefore, Lafayette was busy playing a careful game. He would move his troops, specifically those remaining under the command of Anthony Wayne, into a position where they could have at least made a British retreat difficult. Meanwhile, he was busy working to get as many men off of those transports and onto the ground as possible, as quickly as possible. On September 5th, the British and the French Navy engaged in a seemingly indecisive battle on paper, but one that would set up the French encirclement of the peninsula. The French under de Grasse actually lost more men on the day than the British, who themselves were under the leadership of Admiral Thomas Graves. The French suffered over 330 casualties on the day, which was a full 100 more than the British. However, the British saw 2 of their ships captured, and another 5 take serious damage. This was enough to convince Graves that he had to pull back towards New York, thus giving the French Navy, at least temporarily, full control over the Chesapeake. As this was going on, the French managed to land 2,000 additional troops at Jamestown. Following the battle, de Grasse would pursue the British for a short while. This news had deeply concerned George Washington, who was preparing to leave Mount Vernon, where he had spent the last few days, to continue his journey towards Williamsburg. Although de Grasse was actively chasing the British off, evidence suggests that the point of this was not necessarily to re-engage the British, but rather was to get them as far away from the Chesapeake as possible. What had so concerned Washington about this is that it meant that, at least for the moment, the Chesapeake was dangerously exposed. Now, it would be a missed opportunity for me not to mention that among the major commanders here under de Grasse was Louis-Antoine de Bougainville. If that name rings a bell, it is because when we last saw him, he was busy commanding the troops under Montcalm in Quebec. That time, on the other side of a conflict with the Americans. See, the players really have been the same for a while. With the British evicted, at least temporarily, from the Chesapeake, and de Grasse chasing them away, it was the Comte de Bras who was able to slip into the Chesapeake with his fleet, a fleet that had traveled from Rhode Island, with the intention of linking up with de Grasse. The fleet that Bras was commanding had been up in Newport for a while. Now that it had linked up with de Grasse, it gave the French a clear naval advantage over the British, as the combined French fleet had nearly twice as many ships as did the British. Even if Graves wanted to attempt a comeback, once he had been chased off and Bras had established himself in the Chesapeake, it seems hard to imagine a scenario where Graves would be able to manage to dislodge the French Navy from their new position. Although the Battle of the Chesapeake had not been decisive in terms of losses for either side, the outcome was clear. The French Navy was now firmly in control of the rivers around Yorktown. On the land, the combined Franco-American forces were substantial, numbering upwards of 16,000 men, as compared to Cornwallis, whose own forces numbered a little over 7,000. Washington, of course, was itching for a big win here. He really needed a big win. As he traveled towards the south, he constantly worried that the British fleet in New York would manage to beat de Grasse and the French fleet to the Chesapeake, effectively ending their hope of trapping Cornwallis. Remember that Washington had no idea the status of that naval war outside of the Chesapeake. For all he knew, the British might have defeated de Grasse and chased him off entirely. We know now the outcome of the battle, and that it was the British who would not be returning to the Chesapeake. But Washington did not know this yet, hence explaining so much of his apprehension. All Washington could really do was to order that the men still on the transports in the bay get onto dry land as quickly as possible, and then ride hard for Williamsburg, which is exactly what they did. Washington and Rochambeau would personally reach Williamsburg on September 14th, 3 days after leaving Mount Vernon. Cornwallis by this point realized just how serious his position was. By early September, even Clinton was now recognizing just how trapped Cornwallis was becoming. On September 6, he wrote to Cornwallis assuring him that he was sending another 4,000 troops to help reinforce his position. He was just waiting for the thumbs up that all was good from Admiral Graves. The problem, of course, as we now all know, is that not all was good with Admiral Graves. Clinton was obviously unaware that the previous day Graves had been chased away from the Chesapeake, leaving Cornwallis very, very isolated. By the time that Clinton wrote to Cornwallis assuring him that he would be sending reinforcements, it was already too late. There was no way that Clinton could reinforce Cornwallis, nor was there really anywhere left for Cornwallis to go. He was indeed very much trapped. To wrap up for today, I want to look at the question of exactly why Cornwallis never attempted to withdraw from Yorktown. We know that he never really wanted to go to Yorktown and recognized from the very beginning the dangers of his position. What is seemingly more perplexing, though, is that once the Americans began the process of actually trapping him on the small peninsula, why did he never attempt to break out? It is two very different things saying that, I think this might end poorly, versus, this is going poorly. Once Lafayette began to establish his lines, Cornwallis should have been able to see the writing on the wall, that his fears were becoming a reality. Yet, we don't see Cornwallis make any attempt during this early part of the siege to break out. Lafayette's early efforts at trapping Cornwallis were never going to be able to actually pin him down in Yorktown. If Cornwallis had wanted to escape his situation, he likely would have been able to punch through Lafayette's lines without too much trouble. Lafayette did not have the strength necessary to actually stop Cornwallis from doing anything at all. Sure, Lafayette had enjoyed harassing Cornwallis for the past few months, but Lafayette was never delusional. He was well aware that any major engagement was very unlikely to go his way. All we need to do is look back at what had happened at Green Springs. and yet Cornwallis stayed put. In the months after the battle, Cornwallis would claim that he had remained in Yorktown because of Clinton's promises to rescue him. Clinton responded to this by explaining that although he would have loved to have bailed out Cornwallis, doing so required the British Navy to do their jobs, which, as we have already seen today, was no longer an option on the table by the middle of September. Although Clinton makes this claim, it is worth mentioning that all of this comes after the fact, when he is very much trying to save face. In reality, Clinton did not seem to be terribly worried about the French Navy and just what that might mean for the British. Somewhat ironically, it had been Clinton who had forced Cornwallis into Yorktown in the first place. As we have already talked about, Cornwallis had no interest in that particular location and seemed very well aware of just how dangerous it really was. Knowing this, it feels somewhat hollow when, after the battle, Clinton points the finger back at Cornwallis and argues that he should have extricated himself from the situation, most likely earlier on by busting through Lafayette's lines. Cornwallis, meanwhile, just kept falling back on his argument that he was waiting for Clinton, and Clinton never came. As late as September 17th, Bannister Tarleton, who had taken up his position on Gloucester, was very busily encouraging Cornwallis to do something, anything, to get out of Yorktown. The prospect of escape was indeed growing bleaker by the day. However, Tarleton saw little other choice. Once Washington's army moved into position, escape would be virtually impossible. Cornwallis, despite seemingly having his own doubts, again fell back on the idea that Clinton had promised relief. Tarleton emphatically informed Cornwallis that the chances of that relief coming were now virtually non-existent. But Cornwallis decided to maintain his defensive posture. It is probably not very surprising that following the battle, there would be a whole lot of finger-pointing. In fact, it is something that we are going to spend some time looking at during our final episode this season, when we discuss the fallout from the battle. However, even by September, it seems that the British were making decisions with almost a kind of operational blindness. Clinton had forced Cornwallis to take up an awful position that put him at very real risk of getting trapped, despite Cornwallis informing him that it was indeed a terrible position. Meanwhile, when the walls do start to close in around him, Cornwallis is far too slow in recognizing just how grave his situation had become. If he had been banking on relief from Clinton, it was now way too late in the game when he finally acknowledged that it was not going to be coming, and by that point there was very little he could do about it. Clinton ignored the warnings and only saw the superior port that Yorktown provided. Cornwallis, although correct in his writings that it was a dangerous position to begin with, was too slow to react when it became clear that the Americans were making overtures to trap him. In late August and through early September, there were opportunities for Cornwallis to break through the thin lines of Lafayette and get to safety. He might have been scuffed up a bit in the escape, but the British Army likely would have survived to fight another day. Yet, this also is never going to happen. On September 28th, Washington and his army moved from Williamsburg to begin the process of laying siege to Yorktown. For the British, their last hope of escaping from their predicament vanished, and as we are going to see next time, quickly the walls will literally begin to close in on them. Next time, the Franco-American army begins their siege of Yorktown, in what would be a paramount moment in both the war and in the history of the United States. Until then, I hope you all have a wonderful 2 weeks. I hope that you are staying healthy and that you are staying safe. And I will see you back here next time for the Battle of Yorktown.